really tough act to follow with up to €500,000 check being presented. Maybe a little bit about myself for one moment. So I'm Dominick Kennerson. I'm the head of G4A. If you've never heard of G4A and the work that we're doing at Bayer, we've been around for about 10 years and we do the digital health partnerships and investments based in Berlin for Bayer Pharmaceuticals. I've been in Berlin for most of the last 10 years. I came into Berlin through a program with the Robert Bosch Foundation, which has hugely been focused on the Transatlantic Alliance and the work that's been done there, especially post-World War II. So a lot of what you'll hear and what you'll see through my presentation actually, I think, comes from that perspective and what it means to be a bit transatlantic in this relationship between the US and Europe. I will also try to present a little bit how that fits into Malta. And then I think a lot of that context also has to do with artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we've already heard that AI is a bit of a buzzword in healthcare, but there's actually a lot of important context. So 3 buckets, and I think in the interest of time, I'm already down to 7 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about that US and EU context, artificial intelligence and machine learning in healthcare, and then the Artificial Intelligence Act. So especially post-Trumpism and post-Merkel, there's a lot happening right now on the Transatlantic Alliance stage. Part of, I think, what's really important is that since June, there's actually been a group called the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which essentially outlines the $1 trillion partnership between the US and Europe. So essentially, this accounts for almost half of global GDP. There are a number of companies with about more than half being considered small and medium-sized enterprises between the scope. And then it can almost be assumed that this relationship between the US and Europe highly depends on health and healthcare. What we see from the EU-US Trade Technology Council agenda are things that are highly relevant to healthcare, such as technical barriers to trade, bilateral trade and investment, digital issues and supply chains, of course, cooperation on regulatory. There is a supply chain for artificial intelligence in healthcare. What that looks like, and I should say that that supply chain, there are probably subsectors across this group. So for pharmaceuticals, digital therapeutics, diagnostics, patient monitoring, healthcare providers, and decision support. I think for this group, this is probably a bit of a rudimentary view. But what's important, and something that you maybe heard me mention quite a bit yesterday, is that all healthcare is local. And then I think when we talk about AI or machine learning, we know that this all works based on big data principles. So what does that actually mean when we apply AI, and what does that mean when we apply it to localized structures, I think, especially in Europe? So what we heard yesterday was also some of the context around China. From this EU-based report, they say that China is considered the most active country in AI and in health, followed by the EU and then the United States. In the EU, almost 2/3 of players are involved in research compared to 1/3 in China. And then results from this survey and from this JRC technical report say that nearly half of the companies in Europe are already using some form of AI. These are small and medium-sized enterprises. There are nearly another 20% that are planning on using it, and then there are about 40% that indicated that they're not. Essentially what this report says is that for the US and its AI activity, it's probably not that important. But of course the US has something to say about that. So this is actually information from a US-based report from the Center for Data Innovation based in Washington, DC. What the Center for Data Innovation says, and they actually came up with their own metrics for actually measuring AI and AI impact in an ecosystem, essentially. So what they look at are indicators such as VC and PE funding, the actual deal count, the number of acquisitions in the AI space, the number of AI startups, and the number of firms that have received over $1 million in funding. They also cite patent families and PCT AI patents over a very broad term. And what I tried to do in almost a bit of a rudimentary way also was to actually apply an apples-to-apples comparison from this information. So I used a per capita analysis to do so. And when you look at the US lens on AI, the US actually weighs quite heavily. So on VC and private equity funding, they're spending about $43 per person in the US alone on AI. And you can break that down, I think, in every other category that the US is leading in that regard. So, all healthcare is local, but what about data? What we see from the EU perspective especially is that there have been a number of policies over the course of the last several decades that have been creating these very difficult direct, indirect, and explicit localization procedures when it comes to data sharing, which is, of course, where AI is built and shows the value of AI. Normally, in my longer form of this presentation, I then show some of the market validation aspects that we can take. So the actual publicly traded companies that are working on AI that have not exported to the US and those that have. One of my favorites, and you probably heard me mention this yesterday, is a company like 𝐉𝐨𝐬𝐬𝐿. You know, if you hear Glenn Tolman, he says there's enough work to do in the US, why would I go to the European Union? Interestingly enough, the company that he sold to, Teladoc, they actually do have a presence that spans transatlantic. This is highly uncommon for a lot of digital health and MedTech companies. I think this will especially become the case if the Artificial Intelligence Act moves forward in its current state. So this is kind of one of those alarm bells that a lot of people in Europe aren't talking about right now. I think this is important for Malta because Malta actually has a vice president at the European Parliament level who may be able to do something about this. Also, on the topic of AI, there are a number of Maltese members of Parliament that are also part of the AI committees. But essentially what the Artificial Intelligence Act says is that this will apply to any product that contains artificial intelligence. Then artificial intelligence is put into three categories: prohibited, high risk, and limited risk. And it's probably no surprise that everything related to health and healthcare falls into this high risk category. So what does that mean? In its current state, the Artificial Intelligence Act will cost European businesses about €11 billion per year by 2025, and it will cost the economy €31 billion by then. So what this means for an early company, or for probably maybe some of the companies that we just saw pitch, is that if you have a theoretical €10 million top line, a €1 million net income, you're essentially going to have a 40% profit reduction on your net income in order to meet the standards under the Artificial Intelligence Act. So the portion of the EU that actually falls into this high-risk category, there are €3.4 trillion that fall into this category. For healthcare, 1.3 trillion falls into healthcare GDP. So kind of the portion of EU GDP attributable to healthcare is about 10%. So the digital health market in the European Union would be significantly impacted by this act. So what can be done about it? And in my last minute, what I can tell you is that there are some people that are working on this, including companies like Bayer and a lot of the partners that we work with, like FPA, like AmCham Germany, and the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. So the Digital Therapeutics Alliance did respond to the European Commission's request for comment on the AI Act. They say, well, first you have to harmonize and align this with the other current frameworks. So GDPR, the Data Governance Act, and of course the European Health Data Spaces. They are also asking to really look at this financial implication and impact, and then they're actually calling for understandable and feasible frameworks for small and medium-sized enterprises. So I'm sharing this with you because, again, not a lot of people are talking about it. It's something you should know about if you want to be successful in the EU and scale your company cross borders. So at G4A, what we do is health for all through digital health, and our mission is to scale digital health to create impact, empower lives, and change the experience of health. Thank you.